Yeah, hi everybody. I just wanted to uh, basically provide you with some additional information. Obviously, it's just narrated as I look through some of the questions on the exam that are there. Remember, it's basically four chapters that we're looking at and a total of 70 questions uh, within a 2 hour time window. It deals with skin, respiratory, genitourinary and wound infections are really the four major topical areas that are there. And again, when you start for almost any of the infectious diseases of the skin, you have to think about staphylococcus as being really the most significant player, as well as with wounds. And so typically Staph aureus, and in the hospital, even a lot of Staph epidermidis, as we commented on. Nearly anything can cause an infection. If it's a microorganism, it can. It doesn't matter where it is. And to understand, even though our focus point in this class is usually viruses or bacteria, it doesn't eliminate fungi and yeast or protozoans or anything like that. They all have a play, even though in our world, it's typically more bacteria and viruses that we're dealing with on a more regular basis. And of course, when it comes to bacteria, we're dealing with resistance to antibiotics and the fact that uh, so much resistance has developed over time because of the overusage of antibiotics, particularly with staphylococcal areas. And staph has we look at a cocci under a microscope, and there's just an immense amount of tiny proteins and other things project and toxins that they produce that are just so incompatible with us. So whether it's an exfoliating toxin for scalded skin syndrome or toxic shock syndrome, whether it produces like with streptococcal skin infections like impetigo, whether it produces cuculomarionephritis because of the indirect action of antigen antibody complexes, as it does for most streptococcal infections, that's significant. That is there. We really can't underestimate, and just like we often say, any medicine can cause any side effect. Uh, Almost any infection can cause you problems under the right circumstances. If you take somebody who's immunosuppressed, if you take somebody who's diabetic, if you take somebody who's on other medications, if they have an untoward or unexpected reaction to the medications you give them, all of this is possible. We talk a lot about viruses in this unit, particularly viruses of the skin, like herpes viruses, warts, which are certainly a virus. And we look at warts both from a genitourinary standpoint as well as, and frankly, those are common, but they're not nearly as common as a standard wart on the skin that are literally everywhere. Remember, it's a naked virus. It's very, very difficult to control. It's an RNA virus. It doesn't have an envelope. It persists for long times on surfaces and things. And frankly, it's unusual for kids to go through life without getting a wart. Particularly in their early years. Again, we see them more in the young and in the old as their immune system starts to falter, but most of them have been exposed to that type of thing. So, and with all of these diseases, whether they're skin or respiratory or otherwise, get an idea what the treatments are. For staph, obviously, you have to be cognizant of MRSA and penicillinase and beta lactamase producers and appropriate choices. For streptococci, it's a little bit easier because they're much less likely to be resistant to antibiotics, even though we're seeing an increase of that with more than just penicillins. Fungal infections are really the predisposing factor, as are really even common viral infections of the skin to the secondary bacterial infections. That's really where we see a lot of problems that are there. The most common kinds that we see with regard to fungi are certainly Candida species, particularly Candida albicans. That's everything from thrush in the mouth to vaginal yeast infections to diaper rash. It's not the only one, but they're there that are there. And so, really, you have to sort of the underlying factors, and there's many. They can be hygienic. Most times, moisture really plays a pivotal role with a lot of these entities that we see. We see moisture accumulation. We see allergic reactions. We see so many different things that could be part of it. Okay. When we look at typical viral skin diseases, I mean, you have to know the basics, and the basics are chickenpox being a herpes virus, and measles being rubeola, and chickenpox, and we talked about it any number of times with the idea of latency and coming back out of zoster. And the biggest problem is high fever, and they're not nearly as problematic in children who tolerate the fever a lot better than adults. And in general, these rather nasty viral infections that were typically immunized but were not in the past are relatively common and well tolerated by children. It's not that they don't have problems that are associated, but in adults, there are real problems associated with it. And they're extraordinarily transmissible. They're constantly in our environment, and you have to be aware of that. So most of the time, the problem with these skin viral things that are just rashes or itchy and scratching and secondary bacterial infections. Rubella is an oddball because even though the rash is there and certainly it applies to that, the big problem with that is its transmissibility and crossing the placental barrier and causing particularly nervous system involvement in the unborn child. And I've told you many times since we had the development of the immunization for rubella, part of the MMR. I mean, the amount of hearing and speech abnormalities has dropped tremendously that are there. When you get to respiratory, nearly everything's in your respiratory tract. Almost every bacteria you can think of, with the exception of like fecal bacteria, are typically there. There, so there's a lot. They're part of the standard normal flora that we see. Strep throat being the one that we hear the most about, and you certainly would have to be on lookout for because of all the complications. But it's Group A beta hemolytic Streptococcus pyogenes. The Group A talks to a particular carbohydrate marker. The beta hemolysis is something we certainly plays a role because of its ability to damage the blood vessels and how we diagnose it in the lab. Most of the time, the complications are immunological. There's so many of them. Maybe the worst of these, I mean, there certainly is glomerulonephritis, and there's scarlet fever, which is a super antigen, and we don't, it's certainly there, though we don't see it on such a regular basis because most of the time strep throats are identified and treated because we're kind of on the lookout for them. But in worldwide, it's a greater problem, and certainly a big player with this is the immunological activity that's associated, and all of these really are immunological, is bacterial endocarditis and damage to the heart valves, and it's associated with rheumatic fever because it also affects the joints. That's where the rheumatic comes from. So I think you have to be aware of that. Diphtheria is rare. Again, it's one of those AB toxins. The big problem is the toxin, not the infection part. It's not the damage it does to the throat from being colonized. It's the damage of this toxin creating a pseudomembrane and affecting the kidneys and the heart and the nervous system and inability to breathe. And it's life-threatening without treatment. That's where we have the immunizations associated with it. Again, in the same immunization that diphtheria, pertussis, and tetanus, we have whooping cough, which is bacterial. Same kind of a deal, an AB toxin, except it leads to, again, problems with the mucociliary escalator, difficulty in breathing, that inspirational whoop, that loud noise I don't even try to duplicate anymore. Okay. And, and particularly in younger children, can be really severe, though in older adults and in older children, we can sometimes see it as a chronic cough. Much more commonly are the trio that I think are all associated because their commonality is Streptococcus pneumonia and Haemophilus influenza, although we've identified a number of other organisms in the bacteria family, and those are sinusitis, conjunctivitis, and otitis media. So ear infections, sinus infections, and not all of the time, but conjunctivitis, which can be carried by just rubbing your eyes with dirty fingers, but even can go through all those interconnecting things like the lacrimal canal and the openings from the nasal cavity or by way of the eustachian tube. And they're common. That's why we treat them with amoxicillin and non-penicillin allergic, because the Streptococcus pneumonia is susceptible to basic penicillin, certainly to ampicillin, and utilizing and it's also extended the spectrum or broaden the spectrum for gram negatives like Haemophilus influenza. But it's not the only one. Sometimes you have to use augmentin if it's a beta lactamase producer. That's part of it as well. We always start with antibiotics and with ventilation tubes. With colds or rhinovirus. Pneumonias are much larger problems. The biggest player is still, it has three names and they're all the same: Streptococcus pneumonia, pneumococcus, or diplococcus pneumonia. The big issue is the capsule, as it frequently is, just like Klebsiella pneumonia, which we see more in hospitalized patients and long-term care and incontinent people, and is much more damaging. Pneumonia has a lot of warning signs: fever, difficulty breathing, chest pain. The sputum is very interesting because if it's partially hemolytic or non-hemolytic or very destructive, we all see different things that are associated with it. College students is all about walking pneumonia, which is mycoplasmal, and I think that's all the ones that are relevant historically, and perhaps even more recently. We are seeing things like Legionnaires, which again I thought was a flu presentation, which turns out to be an oddball bacteria that's around, but flourishes with ventilation and water and dusty conditions. Is more common than you think from a standpoint of how it grows. But typically it's susceptible individuals. Interestingly, they just did a test on that. My mother-in-law's back in the hospital as I'm dictating this, and they did a test for interesting. The Legionnaire's disease bacteria is probably one of the ones that they start to see a little bit more in susceptible individuals, even though she would have no exposure from ventilation or water, living in the same house she's lived in for 50 or 60 years, whatever. While it's really technically an immunological disorder, historically we consider it a skin disease because of the target or bullseye rash, and that is certainly Lyme disease. Borrelia burgdorferi is the bacteria carried by the tick bite. The tick is the deer tick, almost all the time, though not exclusively so. Again, it's immunological in the way it presents because it's just like syphilis. When you have these spirochetal diseases, they start off with a rash, it clears, they have secondary presentations, and they have tertiary presentations as it spreads throughout the bloodstream, and then there's an immunological response and a long-term immunological response. The flu is very, very severe. It's specifically, when we talk about influenza, I'm referring to type A, which is the one with the severe problems. Most of the time it's really a problem when it's somebody who's very old or very young for the most part. And again, the response is immunological. We categorize it based on those H and N spikes, the hemagglutinin and the neuraminidase spikes, and that's indeed how we identify them, and to some extent are able to develop different kinds of treatments, particularly neuraminidase inhibitors like Tamiflu and Relenza, which block the N spike from facilitating the release of those viral particles. So that's how we look at them. And the reason they change so much is a phenomenon called antigenic drift. Subtle changes as the RNA, which is genetically unstable inside these 7 to 8 single strands, kind of flip-flop little segments, and the spikes are not the same as the vaccine, or they're mutating almost as though they're being passed. Whereas antigenic shift is this nasty confluence we see in a farm where you have humans and pigs, and you have chickens or ducks, horses, all species that could house influenza. And what happens is it picks up viral particles, bats, and also from other species. It's kind of like what happened with COVID. That kind of, so it picks up novel virus, means it has unique genetic material from different sources that we've never seen before, and provokes an extraordinary immune response, which is potentially deadly. So that's part of the problem that's there. Still, the CDC recommends influenza vaccinations for everybody. It used to be very limited to the old and young, people in healthcare, and people with predisposing conditions. Now everybody gets recommended. I still think we're vaccination crazy a little bit, but I've become less enchanted with flu vaccines after I had a vaccine and got the flu anyway. So go figure. RSV is important because of the respiratory disease of the newborn, particularly in neonates, because of the lack of or the inadequacy of the surfactant, even though we could produce it now, but much more common is the cause of the croup in older kids. And don't forget TB with the kind of damage it does. It's like a cancerous type of thing where it kind of eats away at you. It spreads throughout the body. Uh, Everything, sputum is very interesting because it's kind of classic, that greenish stuff, but it's swirling red because of all the damage. It's got a giant capsule. It's hard to penetrate. It causes that unique necrosis called caseation necrosis or caseation necrosis, kind of foamy macrophages inside. And when it bursts through the lung, it can go in the bloodstream and spread literally anywhere, bones, heart, brain, just like a cancer. It is an airborne, but it takes a lot of exposure. So somebody with TB, you have to take a lot of precautions, which many of you in nursing will learn about. When we get into the urinary tract, again, big player for the most common of all the infections, Candida albicans for the vaginal yeast infections. We have alterations in our normal flora, in the particularly lactobacillus in the vaginal area, and certainly E. coli, because it's typically some degree of fecal contamination, either inadvertent or due to long-term hospitalization or due to just the proximity of the structures which permit and certainly hygienic and things like that, which permit the E. coli or similar bacteria from the in the anal area to get into the genital urinary area that are there. And so again, we don't consider these as sexually transmitted because they're not. They can happen to anybody. Could they be enhanced or potentially be spread by sexual intercourse? I suppose they could, but they're not classified that way. When we get to sexually transmitted, then it's the typical way. When we talk about transmission, always the typical way. So, gonorrhea, chlamydia, trichomonas, yes. Okay, all the gonorrhea, famous historically, still present, very painful, gram-negative diplococci. All of them have the same problem, these drainage diseases, because they ascend in the female and even in the male, where they'll cause strictures, ectopic pregnancies, early onset hysterectomies, infertility, sterility in the male, typically more painful in the male, less so in the female. And that way, sometimes by the time they're really significantly noticeable, a lot of damage has been done. Don't forget pelvic inflammatory disease that are there. Again, gonorrhea and chlamydia are bacterial. Chlamydia is the most common bacterially transmitted, sexually transmitted disease, and the most common reportable disease in that regard as well. Whereas syphilis is also bacterial, but we've screened a lot more. It hasn't gone away. And it's interesting because it's a spirochete and it's mostly immunological, and you get that characteristic hard chancre, but that disappears. And then the rash secondarily after X number of weeks, and that disappears. And then it's still treatable and still infectious. But you go through that latency period, which is typically at least 10 or more years. And early on, it's treatable and you're still contagious. But as it goes longer, it becomes less treatable. And unfortunately, less contagious, good, but problematic because tertiary syphilis is going to ensue, and that's typically going to be fatal. Plus, during the time when it is contagious, you can get congenital syphilis, and this was a big problem many, many years ago. It's called treponema pallidum, and that is, or the pale turning thread, trephine, is a surgical tool, interestingly, but it's think of it as like a spring or a little coil or a screw shape. And pallidum, because it's pale, you can't grow it in culture still. Don't forget HIV. We know about immunodeficiency virus. We know it affects CD4 cells. Eventually, it destroys the helper T cell population. Other ones, hepatitis B, we have under control, more or less with immunization, but not worldwide. Hepatitis C is the big player in this country. Don't forget the drugs of choice. We use a lot of metronidazole because it's anaerobic. It's specific for anaerobes like trichomonas, even though it's a protozoan, or for bacterial vaginosis because it's anaerobic in nature. Very, very effective in that regard. And I think everything else is fairly straightforward. You got to be herpes simplex, particularly the initial or an acute bout of herpes simplex 2 is particularly life-threatening to the newborn. Passed vaginally. TB requires a lot of treatment time. I just want to remind you from antibiotics we've commented on before. Typically, when you get immunized for influenza, and most immunizations like DTP are trivalent, meaning that they have at least 3 different immunizations, sometimes more these days. It's a little bit different with other disorders. Don't forget the association with gonorrhea and septic arthritis. Don't forget the life cycle of Lyme disease. It ain't deer season, everybody. It's when it's seeking a blood meal. In deer season, the ticks have nestled on the deer. That's why it's part of their life cycle, but they're reproducing for the next generation, laying eggs. Whereas in Lyme disease, it's when they're seeking a blood meal, which is now, early spring, summer, even early to late spring, summer, and even into the fall, depending on what the weather is like. That's also part of it. Again, know the ideas of tetanus prevention. Remember, we talked about what dry gangrene was, the fact that it doesn't have an underlying, unless it gets secondarily infected, it's not infectious due to circulation. The role of Pseudomonas in burned patients is important. What causes most commonly necrotizing fasciitis? The Staph aureus and Pasteurella multicoda, which are part of animal bites. Nearly all species have those. That's why we use augmentin, because that staph is a beta-lactamase staph that we can use, and Pasteurella is a fairly easy gram-negative to deal with comparatively. And don't forget human bites. It's all about, typically it's combative, anger areas, and that's where we see alcohol and methamphetamines more than almost anything else. And I think that's everything I have to tell you. Enjoy. And any questions, we'll deal with it appropriately at the time. I'll be sending a mailer out. Thank you.